00061. A magical threat. Tao and Ezekiel walked through a secret facility just outside of Moscow, while inside the mirror dimension. They had already taken over the computer network of the base and walked towards their next recruit as Ezekiel worked on a tablet. Ezekiel stopped walking as he said, "This one is going to be a problem." Tao turned to look at Ezekiel as she asked, "What's wrong?" Ezekiel frowned as he said, "We might have to kill them." Tao frowned and her eyes narrowed slightly as she asked, "Why would we need to kill them?" "Because they're a dire wraith." Tao widened her eyes as she asked, "There's a dire wraith on the planet? You actually know what a dire wraith is?" Tao nodded her head as she said, "Of course I do. They are considered a magical threat to Earth. Although the last one we dealt with was before my time. How did a dire wraith even make it to Earth without my knowledge?" Ezekiel shrugged his shoulders as he said, "I have a theory, but I could be wrong. I also don't see any records about aliens coming to Earth in their files. As far as they knew, she was a human until they took tissue samples. I think we should take care of this threat. A dire wraith can cause a serious problem if left unchecked." Ezekiel nodded his head in agreement as he said, "I won't argue with that, but let's at least see what is going on. This particular one thinks it's human and is proud of its Russian heritage. They also haven't told her that she is an alien. Plus, she was working with us a few times when we looked into the future." Tao frowned again as she said, "The few records I have read about dire wraiths all say the same thing. That they are creatures of evil that have no morals and will do anything to fulfill their own desires. From my knowledge, that is pretty accurate." They continued walking till they came to a new area off the main hallway. After going through a set of doors, it looked like they arrived in a living area for someone. It had a TV on the wall, with a small couch in front of it. It also had a small dining table with 4 chairs around it, along with a small kitchen area. There was a single hallway in the room which looked like it led to a few other rooms. Inside the room, seated at the dining table, was a young woman reading a book. She had long, dark black hair, her irises were red and would sometimes glow slightly as she was reading. She wore what could only be described as a very tiny purple skin-tight bikini in a V-shaped pattern over her hourglass-like figure. The purple straps went over her shoulders and barely covered her breasts before it connected just below her navel. Ezekiel Wolf whistled before he said, "You know, in the comics, they always drew the women wearing almost nothing. I always thought it was the artist's taste, or to attract more teenage boys to read them. I honestly never thought I would see it in person. I gotta admit, I don't hate it." Tao frowned and there was a hint of disgust in her voice as she said, "You know that's a dire wraith. She doesn't actually look like that." Ezekiel shrugged his shoulders as he said, "A man can still appreciate beauty when he sees it." Tao paused for a moment before she glanced at Ezekiel as she asked in a slightly fearful tone of voice, "Wait, was I ever drawn like that?" Ezekiel laughed as he said, "By the normal artists for the comic books? No, you weren't. But by fan artists. Let's just say some people were very imaginative." Tao glared at Ezekiel for his comment. Ezekiel grinned as he said, "Don't get upset. You were the one who asked. Also, I always shipped you with Mordo myself. You shipped me with Mordo?" Ezekiel nodded his head as he said, "Yup, I mean he is a pretty good match for you. Even though you have more of a master." "Enough. I really don't want you to finish that." Tao frowned a little after speaking. Ezekiel grinned again as he asked, "All right, so what is the plan? Magical threats are your wheelhouse." Tao schooled her face before she looked at the woman sitting in front of them reading. She looked back at Ezekiel as she said, "I will send you outside and I want you to try and restore her memories. Let's see how she reacts to her memories. The main thing we need to figure out is how she came to Earth." Ezekiel nodded his head, and after walking to the other side of the room, Tao removed him from the mirror dimension. The woman at the table went on guard and looked up at Ezekiel as soon as he appeared. Ezekiel raised his hands as he said, "Fantasia, I just came here to talk and hopefully help you out." Fantasia laughed lightly before she said in a Russian accent, "You are a foolish man to come here. The guards should be here in less than a minute to capture you." Ezekiel shook his head as he said, "No, I already took care of the security here. We can talk peacefully as long as you want." "As long as I want?" Ezekiel nodded his head as he said, "Of course. I came here to talk, but it's hard to have a conversation if the other person doesn't wish to talk." Fantasia pushed her seat back before she folded her arms under her breasts, which in turn pushed her chest up. Somehow the fabric of her skin-tight outfit didn't break. She smirked as she noticed the man's glance towards her chest for a moment. The man shook his head as Fantasia said, "We can talk until the guards arrive." "So, what do you want to talk about? How about your alien heritage to start?" Fantasia narrowed her eyes as she asked, "What do you mean by my alien heritage? I might have powers, but I'm human." Ezekiel shook his head as he said, "No, you're an alien." He pulled up his tablet and started to type on it. After a few moments, the TV on the wall turned on and on it some info was displayed. Ezekiel gestured to the TV as he said, "That is your DNA on the left, and on the right is a human's DNA, along with the DNA from a mutant. I am sure you can tell the difference with just a glance." Fantasia studied the screen for a few minutes before she said, "That means nothing. You have no proof that is actually real." Ezekiel nodded in agreement before he started to type on his tablet again. He pulled up a video of some people in a room talking in Russian. Fantasia watched the video for a few minutes before she looked back at Ezekiel. She frowned a little as she said, "All right, that might be harder to fake. But so what if I am an alien? Is this what you wanted to talk about?" "Somewhat. I actually wanted to help restore your memories." Fantasia frowned even more as she asked, "Restore my memories?" Ezekiel nodded as he said, "Yes, I believe that something happened and you lost your memories. I wish to restore them. After that we can part ways." Fantasia shook her head as she said, "No, I don't trust you. You can leave now, or wait for the guards to come collect you." Ezekiel had a wicked-looking grin as he said, "Unfortunately, we already started. Don't worry, this shouldn't take too long." Fantasia wanted to respond, but the next second, she was in a weird destroyed space with all kinds of bubbles floating around her. She tried to activate her powers, but nothing happened. The strange man appeared before her after a few moments and said, "We are currently in your mind, and the bubbles should be all of your memories. To restore your memories, we just need to rebuild this place." Fantasia glared at the man before her as she said, "Let me out of here." Ezekiel shrugged his shoulders as he said, "You are the only one who can let us out of here." VVVVV. Tao watched Fantasia for a while before she looked at Ezekiel, who had two fingers currently touching the woman's forehead, and asked, "So how long will this take?" She is fighting back and not helping. But just forcing her into her mindscape seems to be helping. "I think we have about an hour." Tao nodded her head as she said, "I'll go get some help. We'll stay hidden and prepare to capture her if needed." Ezekiel nodded as he said, "Sounds good, but I suggest we wait and see what happens. If she is like the one from a certain timeline, she will lead us to a whole nest of eggs." Tao paled as she asked, "You think there's a nest on the planet?" Ezekiel nodded his head as he said, "I am looking through her fragmented memories, and I have seen some things that make me think so." Tao opened a portal as she said, "I'll be back." She disappeared through the portal right after. Ezekiel let out a chuckle thinking about Tao being AT-800 before he concentrated on his task and tried to find out anything he could about where a possible nest of dire wraith eggs might be. After half an hour, a portal opened, and Tao walked out of it with a few people. Tao glanced at Ezekiel before she looked at Fantasia, who was sweating profusely as parts of her body seemed to be expanding and contracting. Any part that was expanding or contracting would also change different colors of purple. Tao asked in a concerned tone of voice, "What is happening now?" Ezekiel's voice was strained as he said, "She is gaining more power as her memories are restored. You should hide in the mirror dimension. I think we only have a few minutes before she breaks free." Tao nodded as she pulled everyone but Ezekiel into the mirror dimension. After a few minutes passed, Fantasia's right arm shot out as it turned into a purple blade that pierced through Ezekiel's chest. Fantasia watched as Ezekiel coughed up some blood before he collapsed on the ground in front of her. Fantasia pulled her bladed hand back and looked at the blood dripping off it. A 2-foot-long purplish-colored tongue came out of her mouth, which licked the blood clean before she said, "Consider that a thank you for restoring my memories." She smiled to herself as she walked out of the room. As Fantasia walked through the hallways towards the main elevators for the hidden base, she was leaving behind a pile of corpses in her wake. VVVVV. Tao, Ezekiel, and the others followed Fantasia as she walked through the base in the mirror dimension. Ezekiel currently had her in a Jinjutsu, so they could easily follow her to the hidden nest of dire wraith eggs. Wong glanced at Tao and the others as he asked, "I am not the only one who finds her randomly cackling weird, right?" Ezekiel shrugged his shoulders as he said, "No, but there is nothing I can do about it. At least we have a nice view, though." 00062. A lesson learned. Ezekiel and the others trailed behind Fantasia by about 150 feet. It had been over half an hour since they started, and it didn't seem like it would end anytime soon. Ezekiel sighed before he said, "In hindsight, this might have been a bad idea." Wong nodded in agreement as he said, "Any way to speed this up? I'm getting tired of walking." Ezekiel shook his head before he said, "If we don't keep her in the mirror dimension, she'll kill anyone she comes across." "I thought she was under Jinjutsu." "She is, but it's only holding because we are in this controlled environment. If not, it would have broken long ago. I think her alien DNA is just too strong for my current Jinjutsu skills." Ezekiel shrugged his shoulders slightly as he finished. Tao nodded in understanding as she said, "If I fold the mirror dimension, it will speed us up. I just don't know where we are going. Could you make the area under our feet move like a treadmill?" Tao paused for a moment before she asked, "I should be able to, but how will that help us?" "If you can then make that treadmill platform fly, it should speed us up considerably. We will just need to fly in the direction she is walking." Tao nodded her head in understanding as she said, "That shouldn't be an issue, but I will need some help to stabilize the spell." Tao glanced at the other masters she had brought as she said, "Wong, I want you and Kaiselius to assist me. Once I have us in the air, I want both of you to take over keeping us stable. Afterwards, I will control our momentum and direction." Both men nodded before Tao started to fold the neighboring space underneath their feet. The ground started to crumple and fold before compacting together. After a few moments, an area the size of a football field had turned into a platform 20 feet wide and about 50 feet long. The platform then started to rotate underneath their feet as they walked. Once the treadmill portion worked correctly, Tao started to cast a spell. The giant treadmill slowly lifted into the air before it started to slowly move forward. As it did, Wong and Kaiselius worked together to keep the whole thing stable. Once finished, Tao started to increase the momentum of the flying treadmill. It took another hour or so, but when Fantasia started to circle around a certain area on the treadmill, Tao finally landed the construct and dispelled it. As Tao pulled everyone out of the mirror dimension, they were greeted by the biting wind before Wong cast a spell to shield them from the elements. The mountain range they were on was covered completely in snow, and it was hundreds of miles from the closest thing you could call a settlement. They followed Fantasia for another 20 minutes to a small cave in the middle of the mountain range. As they walked inside of the cave, it expanded slightly and sloped downwards before branching off in a few different places. Fantasia continued to choose different paths almost at random for the next half an hour before she came in front of a dead end. Fantasia raised her right arm and put it next to a hole in the wall. Her arm transformed as she pushed it into the hole. The wall in front of her groaned loudly after a few moments and then slid down into the ground. Beyond the opening, lights flickered on one by one, going down a weird metallic hallway for about 30 feet. Fantasia removed her arm from the hole and began to walk down the hallway. As she walked, more lights would flicker on in front of her, and the lights behind would turn off after about 30 feet. As Ezekiel and the others quickly followed along behind Fantasia by about 30 feet, Ezekiel asked, "Is it just me? Or does this feel like a bad horror movie or something?" When Ezekiel received no reply, he shrugged his shoulders and started to work on his tablet as they walked. Ezekiel looked around every few moments, studying his weird surroundings and looking for anywhere he might be able to jack into. They walked past many doors and hallways leading to different areas. Fantasia only stopped after a few minutes passed as she finally reached a door, which opened up into a massive open area. Ezekiel and the others stopped near the entrance of the room, frozen by what was in front of them. Ezekiel looked around the room as he said, "All right, this is definitely an alien pod room." Wong nodded his head slowly in agreement. At the same time, Fantasia finally stopped as she looked around the contents of the room. The giant room contained an uncountable amount of purple and red egg-shaped objects. Fantasia laughed madly as her body started to deform and morph into her original body shape. She lost some of her height, and her overall body expanded in shape. She now looked like some type of weird purple creature which had only 3 claw-like fingers on each end of her arm. Her mouth opened up wide and a 2-foot-long tongue emerged from it, while Fantasia's eyes now glowed a creepy neon green color. As she turned completely around, she said, "Finally, after so long, the dire wraiths will be reborn." Ezekiel frowned as he said, "I think my jujutsu broke." "You think it broke?" As Ezekiel nodded his head, Fantasia laughed as she said, "Of course a minor spell like that broke. But I have to thank you. You made getting here much easier, and now you can fulfill a new purpose. Become food for the younglings." Tao acted first and brought up protection spells around the group. Kaisalius followed suit and also brought up protection spells, while Wong and the others readied their weapons. Ezekiel moved in front of the others and started to speed through hand signs. Fantasia smirked, showing her razor-sharp teeth before she said, "Your efforts are futile. You should already be feeling the effects of being inside this ship. Soon you will be nothing more than food. But fear not, your deaths will serve a higher purpose. You will be the catalyst for the downfall of your world." Ezekiel heard someone fall down behind him as he said, "Unfortunately, this isn't going to end well for you." Ezekiel finished his hand signs as he sucked in a large amount of air. He heard another person collapse on the ground as he said, "Katan, Goka Mekyako." Then he blew through his index fingers that were formed into a triangle. A jet of fire expanded quickly from Ezekiel's mouth, which rapidly expanded and consumed the entire room outside of the shield Tao first created. Fantasia's voice raised in a panic as she yelled, "You insignificant worm! I'll kill you." Ezekiel continued to feed the ninjutsu as Fantasia slammed into the shield in front of him. He couldn't see her, but he could see the magic shield shimmer through the fire every time she hit it. He only stopped when he was almost out of chakra. Once finished, he looked over the room for a moment. The back of the room could barely be seen through the smoke, ash, and heat haze. Almost everything in the room was now covered in a layer of char, soot, ash, and red-hot ciders. Some of the metal panels not covered in a layer of soot were almost molten red in color. All of the eggs had burst open and cooked from the Katan, along with Fantasia, who was a few feet in front of Ezekiel. Her exoskeleton had become black and charred, while parts of it had cracked open. It exposed the softer inner tissue underneath, which had also been charred black, while parts of it were filled with orange glowing ciders. Her right arm was stretched forward in an attacking motion aimed at Ezekiel's head. Ezekiel studied the room for a few moments, the silence only broken by the random pops and cracks from the eggs in the room still being cooked. He turned to look behind him, and only Tao was still in the room. Ezekiel relaxed as he said, "I am not sure what happened to the others, but you should take them to the medical facility to get checked out by Tsunade." Tao nodded her head as she lowered her hands, and her shield disappeared. She looked over the room for a moment before she said, "This seems a little much." Ezekiel grinned as he said, "When dealing with heretics and Xenos, always use the heavy flamer." "The heavy flamer?" Ezekiel nodded as he said, "I will tell you about it some other time." A loud crack happened in front of Ezekiel, and the next second, he turned into a puff of smoke with a purplish-black spear where his head just was. His tablet clattered to the floor as Tao waved her arms, and a new shield appeared around her. She then casted another spell and looked at Fantasia for a few moments. Tao lowered her guard as she realized that Fantasia was now dead, and that attack was her last attempt to take the life of the person who killed her. Tao shook her head as she said to herself, "It's a good thing this was just a clone." Tao let out a sigh, walked over, and picked up Ezekiel's tablet before she transitioned to the mirror dimension to look at the people she placed there. Everyone was knocked out, and she was upset that they didn't notice it sooner. She shook her head and opened up a portal. "It looks like it's not just Ezekiel who was a little lax this time." She started to weave a spell and lifted everyone up as she brought them through the portal. After she walked through the portal, it closed behind her. She walked out of the portal room and clicked on an intercom as she said, "I have 5 people that need treatment. Can I get some help in the portal room?" "We are on the way, hold on." VVVVV. Theo enjoyed the view as he looked out over his backyard. He wasn't sure why he loved to be in trees so much, but he climbed up any tree he could whenever he had the chance. It might be because his old body was confined to a wheelchair, and now he just enjoyed being able to move around freely however he liked. But another thought in his head was maybe he was being influenced by all the ninjas in his head who like to run through trees. Ezekiel shook his head and turned his attention back to the book he was enjoying. Theo was seated on his favorite tree branch in the backyard of his house reading a book when he received his clone's memories. He frowned slightly for a few minutes as he sorted through the information he received. It was only his clone, but he was killed today because he was being cocky. It looked like he was going to have to start focusing on his training soon. A mistake like this couldn't happen even with his clones. He didn't want to form any bad habits from when he used his clones. 00063. Master? After Tao dropped off everyone at the facility to get checked out, she went to Theo and picked up a new clone. They stopped by the base to get a tool bag before taking Ezekiel back to the secret base Fantasia led them to. Nothing had really changed yet besides some of the embers were less bright than before. Ezekiel studied Fantasia's corpses for a few moments before he glanced at Tao as he said, "Let's find whatever passes for a computer. I want to hack into it." Is that even possible? Won't the programming language be written in wraith? You could possibly do it if it was written in binary. But in an alien language, I think it would be highly unlikely. Ezekiel opened his mouth to respond and then froze for a moment before he looked at Tao as he asked, "How do you even know that?" Tao laughed as she said, "I like to learn and I have long since memorized the entire library of Kamar Taj along with all the sanctums." Tao smiled as she said, "Did you think I spent my free time only studying about magic? I've been studying different programming languages for almost 20 years. You have no idea how similar they are to most magic. Especially runic and enchantment magic." Wait, magic is just like a computer programming language? Tao nodded her head as she said, "About 70% or so. Obviously it's a lot different, since if you screw up a line of code you just find the mistake and fix it. If you screw up a complicated spell matrix, you could be seriously hurt, die, or summon something unpleasant." Tao studied Ezekiel for a moment before she said, "It's also why I asked if you wanted to study magic before. Besides your body being an excellent conductor for magic, you are already an amazing programmer. Although I have to admit I've never seen a code so complicated before, I assume it's something from your past life." Ezekiel smiled smugly as he said, "It was one of the programming languages I created myself." Tao nodded in understanding as she said, "All the more reason you should learn magic. Once you learn it, you could create your own magic system with your coding knowledge. You could possibly become more powerful than me, or even strange for that matter." Ezekiel was quiet for a minute as he thought about what Tao said. She had made the offer plenty of times before, but this was the first time she gave Ezekiel a good reason to accept. Ezekiel had always declined because he still needed to train his own powers properly. Even with clones, he thought if he learned magic it would take a lot of time. Ezekiel finally sighed before he said, "You win. I'll learn magic from you." Tao frowned as she said, "I could have saved so much time if I just started with this." Ezekiel shrugged his shoulders as he said, "Honestly, I didn't want to learn because I thought it would be boring and take a long time. Reading a bunch of books on dead languages just to do some magic when I already have powers that should be on par with most magic just seemed counterproductive. While your powers are strong, compared to a true master of the mystic arts, they aren't as strong as you think." Ezekiel smirked as he said, "Just wait till I master Fuinjutsu or my eyes fully develop. Then we can see which is stronger." Tao returned Ezekiel's smirk as she said, "You will understand after you learn magic." "We'll see. Anyways, let's find some place where I can connect my tablet to." Tao glanced around the room then down the long hallway behind them before she asked, "Should we split up to save time? Are you crazy? Have you never watched a horror movie? Always use the buddy system when exploring weird places. First, this isn't a movie, and second, horror movies are horribly inaccurate depictions of monsters and demons." Tao crossed her arms over her chest as she frowned at Ezekiel. Ezekiel shook his head as he said, "Really? You have an issue with horror movies because they aren't realistic enough?" Tao nodded her head. Ezekiel chuckled as he said, "That is ridiculous. Do you know how many people die each year because of supernatural and magical threats?" Ezekiel started to walk back down the hallway as he said, "No idea, but you should call the Winchesters to help out." Tao followed along behind him as she asked, "What are you talking about now?" Ezekiel shook his head as he said, "This is one of the reasons why being reincarnated sucks. No one understands when you reference something." Tao nodded as she said, "Well, explain it, and next time I'll know what you were talking about." Ezekiel shrugged and said, "It's fine. I'll live." As they explored the area, they realized that it wasn't a base they found, but a dire wraith spaceship that was somehow buried in the mountain. It took almost an hour, but they found a room on a lower level that was filled with what Ezekiel assumed was computer banks. Ezekiel seated himself in front of what he assumed was some type of maintenance terminal. The terminal itself stood only 4 feet tall and had a weirdly designed chair placed in front of it. The only thing of note was some small ports on the side along with some holes near the top. No screen, keyboard, or buttons were present on the device. Ezekiel glanced at Tao as he asked, "Do you have a way to open this up?" Tao never moved, but a spell circle appeared around the terminal and removed all of the cover pieces from it. Ezekiel glanced from the terminal back to Tao as he asked, "You can do wordless casting? I didn't think it was possible." Tao smiled as she said, "That's part of your problem. You think this world is like the comics and movies you watched, but that is very far from the truth. Wordless and gestureless casting are hard to master, but the people who do manage it are extremely dangerous." Ezekiel started to look at the internals of the terminal as he said, "I get it. You're a badass." Ezekiel paused what he was doing to look back at Tao as he asked, "Wait, why do you always put up with my antics then?" Tao shrugged her shoulders as she said, "I have nothing else to do currently, and I've been hoping to take you as a personal student. It looks like my persistence has finally paid off." Ezekiel smirked a little as he said, "So should I call you teacher or master now? Sensei? Wani-chan? Or maybe Obasan? Stop it with the Japanese. Just call me master or teacher." Ezekiel bowed slightly as he said, "Yes, sensei." Tao glared slightly at Ezekiel as he smiled and started to look through the internals of the machine again. After 10 minutes passed, he found some wires he assumed was for data and pulled out a multimeter which he used to test each wire for voltage. Tao watched quietly as Ezekiel worked for a few minutes, separating a few wires from the main wire harness. Once finished, Ezekiel pulled out a pair of wire strippers and cut the ends off the wires and stripping them to bare metal. He reached into his bag and pulled out a weird-looking PCB board connected to a USB dongle. Taking the 8 wires he stripped, Ezekiel connected them into slots on the PCB board. As he finished locking the last wire in place, Tao asked, "I have an idea of what you are trying to do, but what exactly is this device?" Ezekiel held up the fully connected PCB as he said, "We never gave them a name, but Hank and Bill helped build a few of these things. They are mostly meant to act as a connection hub, so my tablet can connect to anything electronic. I have a few different types. This one is specifically made for making connections with alien devices. Fury let us borrow some tech from the Kree and Skrulls to test it on." Ezekiel connected the USB dongle portion of it into his tablet and started typing away. When a loading bar appeared on the screen, Ezekiel set the tablet down. He turned to look at Tao as he said, "All right, we have a few hours to kill while this translates the dire race language. What do you want to do till then?" Tao glanced at the tablet for a moment before she asked, "That seems incredibly fast for a little tablet. Is it connected to your personal network to help it out?" Ezekiel pointed to 3 switches on the side of his tablet as he said, "No, the tablet is currently separated from all networks. I don't want to have some alien computer virus let loose on the internet." Tao nodded in understanding as she asked, "Then how is it so powerful?" Ezekiel smiled as he said, "Hank custom made it for me." The tablet was made using a set of shrunken supercomputers along with a power plant and cooling system as the base. He then made everything else from exotic materials and shrunk it down to make it extremely sturdy. Tao eyed the tablet for a few moments before she asked, "Do you think Hank could make me one?" "Probably, but it will have to wait till after he finds his wife. He should be busy fabricating the quantum tunnel for a while." Ezekiel relaxed into the weird alien chair as he said, "Should we do the introduction to the mystic arts while we wait?" Tao raised a single eyebrow as she asked, "You already know about the mystic arts. I don't need to do the whole astral projection pushed out of my body and sent on a mind trip. It's no fun if you already know what's coming. Plus, you don't have a soul. It would only work on your real body." Tao frowned in disappointment when she finished. Ezekiel opened his mouth to respond, then stopped and nodded his head in understanding. He looked back at his tablet, which only displayed 1% completed, and said, "Do you want to explore the rest of this place while we wait?" "All right." 00064. The final recruit? Ezekiel and Tao explored the ship for over 2 hours. Unfortunately, they had to portal through the entire place. All of the doors were locked. When they finished exploring, the tablet was done with translating the dire wraith language. Ezekiel then used his tablet to hack into the computer system. After another 20 minutes, he was able to break through the alien encryption and had access to the entire ship. Ezekiel typed on his tablet for a while before he said, "Good news. Wong and the other masters will be fine." The dire wraiths had a security measure that pumped a low-level odorless sleeping agent into the air. The dire wraiths are immune to it, but most other races are not. Ezekiel glanced at Tao as he asked, "I don't breathe. But why were you fine?" Tao smiled as she said, "I'm a true master of the mystic arts. As soon as we entered the ship, one of my guardian spells activated which filtered the air. Why didn't you warn the others? The best lessons are always learned from our mistakes. When I realized it wouldn't kill them, I simply allowed them the opportunity to learn." Tao smiled like a predator when she finished talking. Ezekiel shivered for a moment under that gaze and instantly realized his magic training wasn't going to be fun at all. Ezekiel then smiled to himself. He had no reason to worry. He was a clone after all. Theo would be the one who would have to deal with Tao's training. Sucks to be him, Ezekiel thought. Ezekiel shook his head and decided to focus on his current task. He wanted to copy over the computer's database and check the status of the ship itself. The diagnostic report for the ship stated that the ship was only running on 10% power. It was enough to run the lights, life support, computers, and a few other things. But weapons, shields, and engines wouldn't work at all unless they found a new power source or repaired the old one. After collecting the ship's data, Ezekiel decided he wouldn't worry about the alien craft for now. It had been buried underneath the mountain for almost 500 years. Another 10 or 20 years wouldn't hurt the thing. Ezekiel, along with Tao, headed back to the egg chamber room and collected DNA samples. Then Tao used a spell to disintegrate all of the organic material in the room. Once finished, Ezekiel made sure the ship was sealed up again, and they portaled out of the ship to the last recruit Ezekiel had on his list. The location they portaled to was in the middle of the Siberian tundra in a heavily forested region. In front of them stood an old dilapidated log cabin with a very wide front door. Ezekiel walked up to the front door and knocked loudly a few times before stepping back. After a minute, he stepped forward and knocked even harder. After no response again, Ezekiel opened the front door as he said, "Hello. We were just in the neighborhood and wondered if you had time to talk about our Lord and Savior Stanley. Isn't it supposed to be Jesus?" Ezekiel just shook his head as he opened the door fully. He looked inside for a few moments before he said, "Looks like he's out and hasn't been here for a little while. Do you have a way to find him?" The inside of the cabin was spacious but very sparse. It was a large single room with a stone fireplace. The only furniture inside was a table with a single chair, a few cabinets, and a lone mattress on the floor next to the fireplace. The most noticeable thing in the room was the empty bottles of vodka that were piled up in one corner of the room, which almost touched the ceiling. Tao walked inside the cabin, and after looking around, she said, "Someone actually lives here?" Ezekiel shrugged his shoulders. His eyes were on the bottles as he said, "I am not gonna judge the man. No one is perfect." Tao just shook her head as she started looking around the room for something to use as a tracker. After finding some tufts of hair, she examined it and said, "I can use a spell to find the location of whoever this hair belongs to. The only issue is this hair doesn't look like it's from a human. It should be from him. He's a mutant." She held the hair up as she formed a spell that circled around it for a few times. After a few moments, the spell disappeared along with the hair. Tao then pulled Ezekiel into the mirror dimension with her. As she opened up a new portal, she said, "I found our target. Let's go." Ezekiel stepped through the portal, followed by Tao, into what looked like a caged fighting arena. The cage itself was gold in color and was shaped like a dome with an open top area, while the floor was mostly made of compacted dirt and sand. Ezekiel pulled up his tablet and started to type on it as he said, "This place is heavily shielded. I can't get a proper signal. Do you know where we teleported to?" Tao shook her head as she said, "The spell I used just shows me where to open the portal. It doesn't tell me where it actually is. We can find out later when I hack their systems." Directly in front of them stood a burly man with no shirt on and some kind of metallic collar around his neck. He was close to 7 feet in height and had very broad shoulders. His upper body was almost completely covered in short, fine brown hair. If you didn't look closely, you would think he was wearing a sweater. His brown hair was cut short, and his brown eyes were narrowed as he studied the person across from him. In the middle of the arena stood a man on a platform suspended in the air. He wore a fancy suit along with a mask. He spoke into a microphone on the platform as he pointed at the other man in the arena. The other person in the arena was a massive man, also not wearing a shirt. His upper body was covered in tattoos and numerous scars. Ezekiel then looked around the outside of the arena and found they were in some kind of building. Outside of the cage was what could only be described as a grandstand, which was almost packed with people. Everyone was dressed up in fancy clothes and wore different masks that fully covered their faces. Above the arena hung large monitors that showed a better view of both competitors, along with stats for each man and the current betting odds. Ezekiel smiled as he said, "Feel like having some fun?" Tao looked around the arena along with the grandstands for a minute before she said, "Sure, great. Let's secretly come out of the mirror dimension and then act like we belong as we try to find a place to sit." Tao nodded in agreement before they left the arena itself and found a secluded spot out of sight. Tao removed them from the mirror dimension before they walked into the grand stands to find some seats. They attracted attention from everyone else since they both stood out so much compared to everyone there. While Tao was in her normal monk robes, Ezekiel was dressed in his umbu outfit, minus his mask. The hum of the arena started to die down before it became deathly silent, as even the announcer and contestants in the arena stopped to watch them find a seat. When they were finished, Ezekiel looked around at everyone before he glanced at Tao as he said, "We should probably update your wardrobe. You attract too much attention. Plus, I think the whole monk thing is out of style now." Tao returned a flat look as she said, "I think not." Ezekiel shrugged his shoulders as he said, "I just think you would look good in a sundress is all, master." Tao was surprised for a moment before she saw Ezekiel's smirk. While everyone around Tao and Ezekiel quickly moved away as they talked, some thug-looking men with masks were walking towards them. Ezekiel looked towards the men approaching them as he said, "You guys look like you are working too hard. You should probably take a nap." As Ezekiel spoke, the men slowed down before they slowly collapsed onto the floor. Some of them could even be heard snoring lightly. Ezekiel glanced around the quiet arena again before he looked directly at the announcer as he said loudly, "We came to watch the fight. Get on with it already." The announcer held a hand up to his ear for a few moments as he listened to someone through his earpiece. Afterwards, he looked around the arena again as he said in his boisterous voice, "All right, folks, you have till the bell rings to finish placing your bets." Once finished, the announcer's platform was pulled up above the top of the arena in between where the monitors hung. The announcer himself watched Ezekiel and Tao until he disappeared from their view. Afterwards, a loud gong was heard, and the two fighters rushed each other before they started to exchange blows. The fight took less than a minute or so, and it was a pretty one-sided beatdown. While the tattooed man may have had fighting experience, the man with the collar was a trained fighter and a very experienced one at that. The collared man disabled the other fighter in the first 30 seconds or so of the fight, and then took the rest of the time to choke the other man out with a sleeper hold. Once the other fighter was unconscious, the collared man released his choke hold and the gong was heard again. The announcer's platform was lowered down into the arena again as he said, "That was a spectacular fight from our newest rising star of the Gilded Cage. Everyone please give a round of applause to Ursa Major 00065. A little mistake, quickly fixed." Ezekiel and Tao stuck around for a while longer after the first fight ended. It just seemed to be some kind of illegal underground fighting arena, as far as they could tell. After they watched the second fight in a row, Ezekiel said, "Let's head out." Tao then pulled them both into the mirror dimension the next instant. Everyone went quiet again right after they disappeared, and more guards ran out to finally collect the first set of guards who were sleeping. Ezekiel moved around the entire place with Tao as they looked for a place Ezekiel could connect to with his tablet. It didn't take them long to find a security room along with a server stack. Tao opened a tiny portal behind the stack, which allowed Ezekiel to access it with his tablet. The small portal was kept open for about 10 minutes while Ezekiel took over their systems and started to dig for information. The portal closed and Ezekiel let out a sigh as he said, "Well, good news. I found out what is going on. Bad news, We need to act fast. What did you find? Ezekiel flipped his tablet around and showed the display to Tao. On it were rows of cages with a bunch of different people locked inside them. Tao noticed the issue immediately. All of the people in cages were fighters for the arena. Tao frowned slightly as she asked, "They are forcing people to fight?" Ezekiel nodded his head as he said, "Not just that, every fighter is kidnapped and they are forced to fight under the threat of death." Ezekiel frowned as he said, "But we need to hurry. Our little stunt spooked the people running this place. They are planning to move as soon as the matches for tonight are finished. They are currently working on disassembling anything not used for the matches and loading them on trucks." Tao opened a portal back to base as Ezekiel talked. They quickly stepped through it as Tao forced them back out of the mirror dimension. Ezekiel walked out of the main area of the portal room alongside Tao as he typed on his tablet. Once finished, Ezekiel said, "I just alerted everyone to what is going on. Some of my clones are headed here, and then we need to stop by Xavier's school to grab him and Magneto." Tao nodded as she asked, "So what's your plan?" "I would like to say smash and grab, but I want to talk with Fury first. Our actions will depend on how much of a headache he wants to deal with. Since I already have control over their systems, it should be pretty easy. Also, Fury will need a portal in 5 minutes." Within a few minutes, a group of people arrived, all wearing Umbu-type gear, and each one with a different mask on. The one in the lead wore a wolf mask, and his spiky silver hair was very noticeable. Another man with less spiky silver hair walked next to him and also wore a wolf mask with a single pronounced fong. Ezekiel smiled as he asked, "Who is the team lead?" The second man spoke up as he said, "I am." "Good to have you, White Fang. Here's everything you'll need. We need an attack plan made, and you only have about 20 minutes. Ezekiel handed his tablet over to the man before he turned back to Tao. White Fang looked over the tablet with two other people, a man in a cat mask and the other man with the wolf mask. As they were quietly discussing what to do, Tao opened up a portal and out walked Fury along with Coulson. Ezekiel smiled at the both of them as he said, "Thanks for coming on such short notice." Fury had his normal scowl on as he asked, "We have about 10 minutes before anyone will realize we are missing, so make this fast." When scouting out our last recruit, we found him in a secret underground fighting arena calling itself the Gilded Cage. Fury looked a little excited as he asked, "You actually found them? Where are they located?" "In Eastern Europe, Zlota, Belarus to be exact. But they are currently scrambling to pack up and move. I think we have about an hour or two before they pack up and leave. I can trace them since I am currently in control of their systems. But since they are currently holding fights, it would be better to take them now." Fury grinned wickedly as he said, "That's perfect. Me and Coulson could be there in an hour or so." "You're in Eastern Europe currently?" Fury nodded as he said, "I know it's a waste of time, but we've been trying to investigate the Winter Soldier base to keep up appearances. But the Russian government has given us a lot of pushback. Might as well tell Pierce we can't get anywhere and head back now. Plus, taking out the Gilded Cage will be nice." "Sounds like a good idea. I was planning to have Magneto make a new video and post it on the website when we are finished with all the info I found. But I could make the post sooner and add the video later. That way you have more of a reason to head there." Coulson spoke up and asked, "If you're bringing in Magneto, then they must also have metahumans with them? How are they even controlling them?" Ezekiel lifted his hand around his neck and made a motion around it as he said, "They have an explosive collar around their necks?" Coulson nodded in understanding as Fury said, "We are headed back. Contact me if anything unexpected happens." With that, Fury turned around as Tao opened a portal for them and they walked through it. Ezekiel looked over to his clones as he said, "Let's go pick up the rest of the team." White Fang and the others stopped looking at the tablet as Tao opened a new portal for them. They walked through it and appeared in the underground area of Xavier's school. Xavier and Magneto were already there waiting for them. Xavier smiled as he said, "So what is the emergency we need to take care of?" "We found a secret underground fighting arena that kidnaps normal people along with metahumans and forces them to fight under threat of death." Both Xavier and Magneto frowned before Magneto asked, "So what is the plan?" Ezekiel pointed to his group of clones, still talking as they looked over a tablet as he said, "Give them a few minutes and they will tell us. White Fang is the mission lead for this. Once the mission starts, I plan to post the info on the website, so we will be on a tight timetable. We might even run into shield or government agents before we finish. Why not wait till we're finished to make the post? Ezekiel had his trademark smirk as he said, Fury is about an hour away. If I post it when we start, there is a good chance he will be there to take over when we finish. Xavier nodded in understanding before he asked, Do you know how many metas they currently have? 5, but they are all adults. So I am not sure what you will want to do with them. One of them is a recruit for us though. So I need to talk with him once we are done. Xavier nodded as White Fang walked closer, handing Ezekiel his tablet back. He looked over to Magneto as he said, Your main job is to work on controlling the outside. You will be placed outside, and you need to take care of their transportation. If you see anyone outside, capture and detain them. White Fang then looked at Xavier as he said, When we enter inside, you will be with Tao, and your main job is to put everyone in the arena grandstands asleep. My team will handle the rest of the building and the fighters. A few will be sent to the prison area when we start while the rest will enter with you and Tao. White Fang looked over at everyone as he asked, Any questions? When no one spoke up, he looked at Ezekiel as he asked, How long till you are ready? Ezekiel typed away on his tablet as he said, Not long, 5 to 10 minutes at most. Good. Everyone double-check your gear and your hinge seals. I don't want any mishaps. Ezekiel finished up over the next few minutes before he pulled out his bare face mask and put it on. He looked over to Tao as he said, Portal Magneto now. Ezekiel glanced over at Magneto as the portal opened for him. Ezekiel said, Wait 30 seconds, then start. Magneto nodded his head as he floated through the portal into the night sky above an abandoned-looking warehouse area. A few miles away, he could see the lights of a city. He looked over the area for a few moments, deciding the best course of action, until he heard people yelling and gunshots. He raised an arm and wrapped up all of the people outside loading trucks with metal that he ripped off from the trucks. He looked over to one of the buildings and lifted his right arm as the entire roof of the building was ripped off. Inside of the building were a bunch of cars, trucks, and limos parked in rows. Magneto smiled to himself as he thought, This never gets old. He raised his left arm as all of the vehicles in the warehouse floated into the air before he moved them into certain spots. He waved both of his hands downward, and the roof along with the vehicles slammed into the ground, causing a small earthquake and some small explosions. There was now a wall around the entire warehouse area being used for the fighting arena. Magneto then lifted the roof off of the fighting arena and slammed it into the ground next to the other roof. Afterwards, he floated in the air like a god as he watched for anyone trying to escape. 00066. A slight roadblock. Mikhail laid on the floor of his cell as he thought about the past few months. He had gone from a respected major in the Russian military to a prisoner forced to fight for his life. He chuckled to himself a little. Besides his rank and status, nothing really changed. His entire life had been about fighting to live, to survive. Back before he was dishonorably discharged, his life was pretty much the same. Fighting for his life on what amounted to pretty much suicide missions with his small team of outcasts. A team forged through fire that considered itself more of a family than anything else. His superior never considered any mission he sent them on as suicide missions though. They were, in his words, missions that only freaks like you can survive. Mikhail's thoughts became dark as he thought about what happened, and he reached up and fingered the collar around his neck. Before he knew it, his hand had slipped underneath the collar as a thought of just ripping the collar off and ending it all passed through his head. He stayed that way as the minutes ticked by as his mind played with the idea, and his eyes teared up slightly as his thoughts became darker. It would be so easy, all he had to do was pull at it, and everything would be over. As he laid there with his dark thoughts, one memory burst forth in his mind, and his hand tightened just a bit. But as the memory replayed in his head, his grip finally relaxed and he shook his head, clearing it of his dark thoughts. No matter how much he would love to just end it all, he couldn't. He needed to avenge his friends first. But first he needed to escape. He had already wasted a month being a prisoner and fighter for these assholes. He needed to figure out a way to remove his collar without losing his head. As for escaping, that would be easy. He paused as his thoughts wandered again. What would he do if he could escape? Go back to his cabin to drink his sorrows away again like last time, instead of seeking vengeance for his friends. Mikhail was deep in thought when he heard some people yelling before gunshots rang out. At first, he thought one of the fighters was trying to escape again. It had happened a few times since he was brought here. But afterwards, it sounded like a bomb went off as the ground shook for a moment. As Mikhail jumped up from the ground, it shook again as the sound of metal being loudly ripped apart sounded from above, before another explosion was heard. Mikhail wasn't completely sure what happened, but prepared to take advantage of the situation. That was until he saw the people with red and white masks as they passed his cage. Each person flickered past faster than a normal human should be able to move. He only noticed because of his enhanced visual prowess. Mikhail grinned. Hopefully this was his ticket out of this place. Mikhail touched the collar around his neck for a brief moment. Hopefully these people were here to free him and the others. After 10 minutes passed, some men in red and white masks walked back into the room. They walked up to each cage, and the people in each cage collapsed onto the ground. Most of the other prisoners started to yell in a multitude of languages as they watched people collapsing to the ground for no reason. Mikhail and a few others were quiet as they watched the masked people work. One of the men in a wolf mask arrived in front of Mikhail's cage and opened it as he said, "Follow me. Someone wants to talk with you." Mikhail glanced at all of the prisoners on the ground, then decided to follow the man in the wolf mask. As they walked to the upper level of the warehouse, they passed piles of people collapsed on the ground. Some of them looked fine, but some of them had pools of blood spreading out from their bodies. As they walked up the last flight of stairs, Mikhail first noticed the stars and the roof of the building missing. Then he saw the man who hovered in the air above the building and paused for just a moment. It was hard to tell in the night sky, but Mikhail knew who was floating up there: Magneto. Mikhail smiled to himself. If Magneto was here, then he should have his freedom. He resumed walking up the stairs till they reached the ground floor, where Mikhail could see all of the spectators slumped in the grandstands where they were seated. Near the bar area of the grandstands stood two people and a man in a wheelchair. Mikhail paused his steps again for a brief moment because the two people he had seen earlier were here. The people who caused a commotion just before his match for the night started. Once he was next to them, the man who was dressed like the people in red and white masks said, "The collar is disarmed. You can remove it." Mikhail hesitated for a moment before he transformed into his more preferred form. As his body grew, the collar around his neck snapped, and he removed the remnants from around his neck. He now stood over 8 feet in height, while his upper body was almost double in size and covered in thick brown fur. His face had warped into that of a bear, and while thick hair now covered most of his body, it stopped around his hands, which didn't change much besides how big they were now. Mikhail grinned down at the people before him as he said in his thick Russian accent, "I owe you a debt, comrades." The man with black eyes and black hair who was standing smiled as he said, "Don't mention it. We honestly came here originally to find you in the first place. I have a job offer for you." Mikhail nodded his head slightly as he said, "I owe you a debt. If you allow me to take care of some unfinished business I have, I will gladly work for you." The man shook his head as he said, "You should probably find out about the job before you accept it." The bear man shrugged his shoulders as he walked around behind the bar. As he picked up a bottle of vodka, he said, "Does it really matter? I most likely would have died here if you didn't show up." Mikhail ripped the pour spout off the bottle before he started to pour the bottle into his mouth. When he finished the whole bottle, he tossed it to the side and grabbed another bottle of vodka as Ezekiel said, "I would much rather have you join for the right reason than from a sense of debt you owe." Mikhail paused for a moment before he asked, "Fine. What's the job you have for me?" He then started to empty the next bottle of vodka into his mouth. "We can talk about it more after we leave here. For now, you can enjoy the bar while we finish up." Mikhail finished the other bottle and tossed it to the side as he said, "Pity, they don't have much vodka here." Before he picked up another bottle and ripped off the top of it, Ezekiel shook his head as he watched Mikhail go through another 6 bottles before he ran out. His bare face looked disappointed before he pulled out a bottle of brandy and started to drink that instead. While Mikhail was drinking, Ezekiel's clones had gone through and cuffed everyone with disposable zip-tie cuffs. They also moved everyone to the ground floor, including the prisoners. As they worked, sirens could be heard in the distance as police and emergency vehicles approached the scene. The prisoners were set to one side while the metahumans were grouped together next to Xavier as a handful of bodies were placed in the arena. Once everything was finished, Ezekiel typed on his tablet before a ringing was heard from it. After a moment, a gruff man was heard as he asked, "What is it?" "We are done on our end. Where are you at?" The man sounded frustrated as he said, "We are close, but we are being held back by the WSC and Pierce. We need to wait for them to grant us access." Ezekiel typed away on his tablet for a few moments before he said, "Oh, I see why. A few of the people here are government officials for different countries or big-time CEOs for companies. They must be stalling for time to get these people out. I was thinking the same thing. It would be harder to pin this on them if they weren't there in the first place." Ezekiel smirked as he said, "Well, what if we took these people with us and then brought them back once you arrived?" "No, they could say they were planted and weren't actually part of it." Tao spoke up as she said, "I could place a spell on them to hold them in place until you or Coulson release them." "That's a better idea, but that might also raise some flags." Mikhail finished another bottle of brandy, and as he tossed it aside, he said, "Just bring a news crew in to film it all?" Ezekiel paused for a moment before Fury said, "Normally I would say no, but that might be the best option." Ezekiel typed on his tablet for about a minute before he said, "Sounds good to me. I am finding some reporters right now, and we will do a live broadcast so it can't be stopped. I will talk to you later." Ezekiel didn't wait for a reply as he disconnected the call and looked up to White Fang as he said, "Quickly line up everyone in the grandstands and remove everyone's masks." The man nodded his head as he yelled, "You heard him. Remove everyone's masks." Ezekiel's clones quickly moved around the area to remove the mask of every person there. As they worked, Ezekiel looked at Tao and said, "Send Xavier and the other metas back. Then I want you to pull us into the mirror dimension when the others are finished. Only Magneto should greet the reporters." Tao nodded her head and opened a portal for them as Ezekiel worked away on his tablet for a few moments. He looked up to Magneto as he said, "Have any questions?" "No." Ezekiel then looked around at his clones that just finished as he said, "All right, let's go." Tao moved her arms and pulled Ezekiel, his clones, and Mikhail into the mirror dimension as 5 portals opened up. Each portal was twice as big as normal and were opened up to different newsrooms that were currently broadcasting a special live show that just started. It only took a moment for each news crew and reporter to cautiously exit the portal. They all looked around in shock for a few moments before a voice above them said, "You have half an hour. Make it count." The reporters all glanced up at Magneto before they started talking to their cameramen and moved into the grandstands, not wasting any time. A few minutes after they started working, Ezekiel's tablet beeped twice before he answered it as he said, "Joe's Pizza, is this for pickup or delivery?" "Cut the shit, Ezekiel. I just got the go-ahead from the WSC to head in. They want me to stop the broadcasts and detain everyone. They wanted me to cut the live feeds, but my teams aren't having any luck, so they want me to move in and stop it. I'll be there in 10 minutes. We will be gone in 9. As Ezekiel cut the call, he asked, "Did you get that, Magneto?" "Yes, I will take care of it." 00067. Talking to a drunk bear. Ezekiel was seated across from Mikhail in a meeting room underneath Xavier's school. They had just arrived after finishing up at the warehouse. Ezekiel typed on his tablet for a moment to bring up Mikhail's information before he said, "I wanted to ask a few things before I tell you about the job. I also wanted to ask about your unfinished business." Mikhail nodded in reply. So Ezekiel asked, "You had a pretty impressive military career for the past 16 years, but you were recently dishonorably discharged. What happened?" His bare face scowled as he said, "You probably have my records. They should tell you what happened." "They do, but I find that most records tend to obscure the full story most of the time. So I want to hear what happened from a person who was there instead." Mikhail gave a grunt before he said, "I was in charge of a small team of metahumans. We were used for missions considered too dangerous for normal people." Mikhail chuckled, which sounded more like a growl, before he said, "Most of our missions were pretty much one-way tickets. We were dropped in somewhere with no exit strategy in place. We either completed the missions and fought our way out, or we died." Ezekiel frowned as he asked, "That wasn't in any of the after-action reports?" "Of course not. That sorry excuse for a base commander always made sure to cover his tracks. I wouldn't be surprised if he never put exactly what our mission parameters were in any of the reports." Ezekiel typed on his tablet for a moment, and a monitor on the wall turned on with a mission report on it. He glanced at it as he asked, "Tell me about this mission." Mikhail studied it for a few minutes before he scowled as he said, "That motherfucker. The only thing that isn't a lie is the location and the target. Little to no resistance, my hairy ass." Mikhail's eyes unfocused for a few moments as he said, "We were dropped into a secluded valley at night with only one ground-level exit. Our target was in the back of the valley nestled in a reinforced cave system." Mikhail shook his head and his eyes became clear as he said, "They sent us in because every weapon they used on the place didn't work. It was actually a fortified bunker, and fortunately my team had the ability to get inside." Ezekiel listened quietly as Mikhail explained how terribly the mission went. Yes, they completed the mission, but all of them were seriously injured and barely made it back. But that wasn't the first time that happened. Almost all of the missions ended up like that. They were sent on missions with impossible odds and somehow made it out alive each time. The only positive takeaway was that it helped to forge his team into an extremely dangerous and tight-knit group. After a few hours, Ezekiel asked about Mikhail's last mission. Mikhail looked pained when he read the report and slowly recounted what actually happened. His team had been given another mission, but this time it really was an impossible task for his team. Someone had leaked the mission info to their target, and they used it to create an ambush that was designed around his team's weaknesses. While his team wasn't wiped out immediately, they were forced into a running retreat with some of them wounded. But as they retreated, it just became worse and people started to sacrifice themselves so the others would be able to make it. Unfortunately for Mikhail, his ability to heal rapidly was a gift and a curse. He watched as the people he considered family died one after another, all so that the rest would be able to live. He ended up being the last person alive, but even then he still fell in the end. It was only through some miracle that he didn't actually die. When the people who attacked him finally saw him collapse, they also noticed his body was no longer healing, so they left him to rot, thinking he was a corpse like the others. Instead, it was just that his ability had been used to the extreme and stopped working. But after laying in a crater for a few hours, it started working again. As Mikhail talked, his voice became more strained till finally he stopped. His head was lowered, but Ezekiel could still see his eyes were misted over and unfocused. Ezekiel cleared his throat before he asked, "Mikhail, would you allow a friend of mine to help you out?" Mikhail's voice cracked slightly as he asked, "Can your friend bring people back from the dead?" Ezekiel shook his head as he said, "No, unfortunately he can't. But he has an ability that is very useful in cases like yours. You can think of it as a very advanced therapy program. It takes things that normally take years to fix only hours at most. You will still have to work through everything, and you will be sharing your memories with him. But it helps." Mikhail sat quietly for 10 minutes as he considered the offer before he finally just nodded his head in reply. Ezekiel then typed away on his tablet for a few moments. Within a few minutes, a portal appeared, and out of it stepped a pale-skinned man with ash-blonde hair. He smiled as his pale green eyes took in the two people in the room with him. He walked next to Mikhail and extended his hand out as he said, "Nice to meet you. I am Anoichi." Mikhail glanced up at the man, his eyes still moist. He reached out and shook his hand as he said, "Mikhail, Ezekiel told me about your issue. We can start whenever you want." Mikhail nodded his head, so Anoichi did some hand signs and then touched his forehead. As they worked on Mikhail's mind, Ezekiel decided to be proactive. He already had a good idea what business Mikhail needed to finish, so he picked up his tablet and got to work. An hour passed, and unfortunately Ezekiel had found nothing new, just the same information he had already gathered. So he decided to change tactics and sent a message to Tao asking for a ride. After a few minutes, a portal opened, and out of it walked Mordo. He glanced over at Ezekiel as he said, "The Ancient One said you needed some help." Ezekiel stood up as he said, "I need a ride to a few places in Russia." He held up his tablet and showed Mordo a military base in Russia as he said, "We need to teleport there, and we'll need to explore a few places while inside the mirror dimension." Mordo pulled Ezekiel into the mirror dimension with him before he opened a portal. After they stepped through the portal, they were greeted with the sight of the military base waking up. As Mordo looked around the place, Ezekiel said, "Our first stop is the base commander's office. We need to search that place thoroughly." As they walked in the direction of the commander's office, Mordo said, "I wanted to thank you for helping Kaiselius. The other masters and I have noticed he is doing a lot better now." Mordo paused for a moment before he said, We aren't exactly sure what happened, but the Ancient One said it was because of your help. So, thank you." Ezekiel nodded in reply as a smile played across his face for a moment before he said, "I'm glad I was able to help. He's a good man, and I didn't want him to suffer a terrible fate." They stayed silent after that and focused on their task at hand. The first place they stopped came up empty even after Ezekiel hacked into the man's computer. Once finished, they made their way to the base's main computer servers. Ezekiel spent another hour going through the base's servers that weren't connected to the internet. Mordo wasted no time and used some spells to look around the base for hidden areas. When they were both finished, they only had two options left. One was to go directly to the base commander and try to get answers. The other was to go to the man's house and search for any clues there. They decided to go with the second option first and teleported directly inside the man's home. As they searched the man's house, they found a few things, the main one being a hidden room in the basement behind a false wall. Inside the room, they found a safe, an expensive computer that was heavily encrypted, and a few filing cabinets. As Ezekiel left his tablet alone to bypass the computer's encryption, he looked through the filing cabinets while Mordo used a spell to unlock the safe. The only thing inside the safe was just a bunch of money, and the filing cabinets turned out to be not much help either. The computer, on the other hand, turned out to be a gold mine, and also the thing Ezekiel was looking for. On the computer was pretty much every off-the-books mission the base commander had set up. While some of the missions Mikhail and his team had were legit and sanctioned by the military, it turned out most of them were just the commander using them as guns for hire, and only he was making any profit. The most damning was the last file, the one where Mikhail's team died. It turned out that the commander wanted to retire and didn't want any loose ends. So he made one last deal to sell out Mikhail's team and collect a nice bonus at the same time. Ezekiel frowned as he finished going through all the data. He knew he might find something, but this was not what he expected to find at all. He disconnected his tablet, and as he stood up, he let out a sigh. Mordo glanced his way as he asked, "What did you find?" "Just the dregs of what humans should be." Ezekiel shook his head before he asked, "Want to help me calm down an angry bear?" 00068. An angry drunk bear? Ezekiel and Mordo ported back to Xavier's school to find that Inoichi was done with Mikhail. The two men were seated next to each other at a metal table as they quietly conversed. Mikhail looked a lot better and was actually in his human form now. But there was still a hint of deep sadness in the man's eyes, which was tinged with anger and determination as he looked up at Ezekiel, who just returned. Ezekiel glanced over at Inoichi as he said, "Thanks for your help. You can head back now." Inoichi reached over and placed his hand on Mikhail's shoulder as he said, "I'd like to stay with my new friend here for a while more." Ezekiel smiled as he said, "That's fine. We might need an extra hand anyways." As Ezekiel pulled out a chair and dropped down into the seat, Mordo moved over next to the back wall. Ezekiel then set his tablet on the table and looked over at Mikhail as he asked, "Tell me about your unfinished business." Mikhail glanced down at his hands resting in his lap for a moment before he looked up at Ezekiel as he said, "I want to find out who caused my team to die." Ezekiel glanced at his tablet for a few moments as he asked, "What will you do when you find them?" "Kill them slowly." Ezekiel looked back up at Mikhail as he asked, "What about the people who actually killed your team?" "I just want the person who leaked our info and made us fall into that trap. I won't blame the others for following their orders. That would just make me a hypocrite." Ezekiel nodded his head before he picked up his tablet as he started to type on it. The monitor on the wall powered on and some files were displayed. He glanced at Mikhail as he said, "I figured you would ask for vengeance, so I was proactive about it. Do these look familiar?" Mikhail slowly nodded his head as he was reading over the info on the screen. As he was reading, he became agitated. As he continued reading, he leaned forward as his hands were placed on the table. His hands unconsciously clenched and deformed the table they were resting on. As his eyes took on a hard edge as he looked back at Ezekiel as he asked, "Is this all true?" Ezekiel nodded his head as he said, "Yes, but it only gets worse from here." "Show me." Ezekiel tapped on his tablet, and some more documents appeared on the screen. It took a few more minutes before Mikhail said, "Next." This continued for about half an hour until the last document appeared. As Mikhail was reading it, his body started to grow and morph. The more he read, the faster his body transformed, until Inoichi was forced to move away. Ezekiel picked up his tablet and backed away towards Mordo as he typed on it for a moment. Mikhail didn't stop at his hybrid form, though, and as he grew, the metal chair underneath him deformed and collapsed under his weight as his pants ripped apart. But he kept growing after that, and even sitting with his butt on the ground, Mikhail was forced to hunch over as his head and neck easily touched the ceiling that was 10 feet tall. Mikhail's bare form was massive when he finished his transformation, which made Mordo say, "I thought you were joking." Before Ezekiel could reply, Mikhail let out a massive roar which actually shook the entire room as he smashed the table in front of him. Luckily, it was completely made out of metal, so it mostly just deformed and collapsed into the floor. Mikhail looked down at Ezekiel as his inhuman voice growled out, "Take me to that bastard." "I will, but I need you to calm down first." Mikhail slammed his massive paws down into the already ruined table and floor as his body leaned forward closer to Ezekiel. His eyes were filled with anger as he growled out, "You would deny me my vengeance?" As Ezekiel shook his head, he said, "No, I will gladly help you with it. I just need you to calm yourself down first." Mikhail glared down at Ezekiel, but Ezekiel just pointed towards the table and floor below it, which were completely ruined now, as he said, "I need you to control your anger, then I will help you take your vengeance." Before Mikhail moved again, Inoichi moved in front of the bear and touched one of his paws as he said, "Take a deep breath, my friend. We are all here to help you." Mikhail glanced down at Inoichi as his eyes lost their hard edge. The massive bear let out a sigh as he started to shrink down. It took a minute, but he finally returned to normal, sitting on the floor naked. Inoichi walked over to Mikhail and placed a hand on his shoulder as he said, "Thank you, friend." A moment later, the door opened and Magneto walked in with some clothes in his hands, followed by Xavier and Logan, who was pushing his wheelchair. They all took in the state of the room for a few moments before Magneto handed the clothes over to Ezekiel as he said, "I was wondering why you asked for me to join you and bring some clothes." Ezekiel tossed the clothes over to Mikhail as he said, "Put those on while Magneto fixes the room." Mikhail quietly stood up and dressed as Magneto reformed the floor, table, and chairs that were crushed. As Magneto worked, Xavier and Logan moved next to Ezekiel before Xavier asked, "What happened?" Ezekiel handed his tablet over to Xavier as he said, "The short version is, his team was led into an ambush and killed because of his base commander. Those are all the files I found about it." Ezekiel moved back to the table and sat down on the other side of the table from Mikhail and Inoichi, while Magneto moved next to Xavier and they read over the files on Ezekiel's tablet along with Logan. Inoichi had his arm on Mikhail's shoulder as they talked quietly for a few minutes before Mikhail finally looked up as he said, "Sorry for losing control. So now what?" Ezekiel smiled as he said, "It's fine. I honestly thought we might have to subdue you. I'm glad it didn't come to that. It shows that you are already healing." Ezekiel's smile changed and became more wicked looking as he said, "Now we'll help you with your revenge. I think we will grab your former commander so you can have a nice personal talk with the man." Xavier glanced up from the tablet as he said, "Killing the man isn't the best way to handle this. This information should be turned over to the proper authorities and they should handle this matter." Ezekiel looked back over his shoulder to speak as Magneto said, "I don't think Ezekiel was asking for your opinion, Charles. But more bloodshed isn't going to help." Magneto placed his hand on Xavier's shoulder as he said, "Not everyone thinks the same as you, my old friend. I think Mikhail is a lot more like me and Logan when it comes to dealing with something like this." Ezekiel nodded his head as he said, "I think the same way as Magneto, which is why I made the offer in the first place." Xavier let out a sigh and handed the tablet to Magneto as he said, "I don't agree, but I can't stop you. I'll be bringing this up at our next meeting, though." Xavier glanced up at Logan as he said, "Take me to my office, please." As they started to move towards the door, Xavier glanced at Ezekiel as he said, "I can't stop you, but take your revenge business elsewhere. I don't want you killing someone at my school." Ezekiel nodded his head as he said, "I never planned on it." After Xavier left, Ezekiel looked back at Mikhail and said, "I can give you two choices. The first is I let you kill the man outright. The second one, you will still kill him, but we do it my way." Before Mikhail could respond, Inoichi spoke up and said, "I know you wish to kill the man outright, but trust me, You should choose the second option. Mikhail glanced at Anoichi for a few moments before he looked back at Ezekiel and said, "All right, we'll do it your way." Ezekiel had a Cheshire cat-like smile as he said, "Great. Now this will take a couple days of prep work, but I think you'll like it." VVVVV. It had been a few days since the nightmares started, and it had taken over his life completely. He kept waking up screaming in terror, covered in sweat. The worst part is he would randomly fall asleep even if he wasn't tired. After it happened a couple times in his office at the base, he decided to just stay home for a few days. But that just made it worse. He would wake up screaming, then fall back asleep within a few minutes. He couldn't even remember the dream completely, just the forest. The endless forest was the only thing he remembered clearly. The rest of the dream was a blurry mess he could never remember. Something at the back of his mind kept telling him there was something very important from the dream he was forgetting, but it was always just out of reach. He was laying in his bed, having just woken up a few minutes ago, when he felt himself falling back asleep again. How many times was this now? He had stopped counting after the 100th time. 00069. A bad dream? He woke up in the middle of a forest, unsure of how he even arrived there. The last thing he remembered was laying in his bed as he had just woken up again from a nightmare. The nightmare. He looked around and realized he was dreaming again. Something felt different this time, but he couldn't figure out what it was. He stood up and took stock of his situation. He was still in his dress uniform, and his sidearm was thankfully still on his hip. His dress shoes wouldn't help here, but they were worn in and comfortable. Other than that, he had nothing else on him. The same as every other dream, he thought. Next, he looked up into the sky through the forest of massive pine trees to notice the sun seemed to be in the middle of the sky. As he looked up at the sky, he heard something behind him, which made him whip around to look as his hand went to his sidearm on instinct. Nothing was behind him, but he slowly walked his way to where the noise came from. After a few moments, he heard another noise coming from directly behind him. He spun around this time with his gun in his hand, but found nothing. He paused for a few moments and waited, but nothing happened. He let out a nervous chuckle as he thought to himself, "My nerves must be getting to me. This nightmare is fucking with my head." He holstered his gun and walked next to the closest tree and studied the base for a moment. The first tree had no moss around its base, but the second tree did. Once he figured out north, he started to move towards the south where he could see some mountains in the distance. He started to make a list of stuff he would need to find: water, food, shelter. He stopped himself. This was just another nightmare. He didn't need food or water. He spun around again as another sound was heard from behind him, but nothing was there. He shook his head before he heard a loud roar of an animal off in the distance to the north of him. He frowned as his hand rested on the grip for his sidearm. He turned back south and increased his pace a little as he walked towards the mountains. He wasn't sure why, but in every nightmare he always moved south. He didn't want to admit it, but something was very wrong with this nightmare. He had spent hours as he walked through the forest towards the mountains in the distance. But the mountains looked the same distance as when he started, and the sun still seemed to be high in the sky. While those happened in every one of his nightmares, something about this one felt wrong. It didn't feel like the other ones. It felt real, maybe? A noise was heard from behind him, but he didn't turn around this time. He lost count of how many times he had heard something, only to turn around to find nothing like in every nightmare. So he decided to just ignore the sounds and concentrate on moving towards the south and the mountains. He tightened his grip on his sidearm as he heard another monstrous roar to the north behind him. It seemed to be closer this time, and it had been getting closer as time passed. That seemed new, but he couldn't remember as the nightmares always became hazy at this point. He increased his pace again into a light jog, but never took his right arm off his sidearm resting in his holster. But the feeling of wrongness never left him. He used his left arm to wipe the perspiration from his forehead as he moved through the trees. He had lost track of how long it had been since he started running, but his chest hurt with every breath he took and his calves felt like they were on fire. But he never stopped moving. He couldn't. It was close now. He could almost feel its hot breath on the back of his neck. Its roaring had become less frequent, and something in the back of his mind told him it was familiar. He shook his head a little. Of course it was familiar. He had lost track of how many times he had this same nightmare. After running all out for a while, he finally collapsed on the ground. His body had given up on him and no longer responded to his commands. He took torturous, ragged breaths as he looked at the bright sky above him. He knew this is where the nightmare always ended. The beast was close now, and right as it pounced, he would wake up screaming. Less than a minute passed as he laid on the ground. His eyes closed as he waited to wake up. He had never heard the beast as it approached him. The sound of his own heart was always deafening as it thundered away in his ears. His body flinched instinctively when he felt the beast's hot, putrid breath wash over his face. That was definitely new. He was sure that had never happened before. He shook his head. It was just another nightmare, and soon he would wake up. His eyes shot open as unbearable pain exploded from his right foot, and he let out an agonizing scream. He reached for his sidearm on instinct, and with his shaking hand aimed it at the beast that had just ripped his foot off. He quickly squeezed the trigger only to hear the distinctive click of a dry fire. He remembered immediately that he had no round chambered, and worked through his pain to quickly pull back the slide and chamber this first round in his gun. He took aim at the beast as it was about to bite his left foot. As he pulled the trigger, that same distinctive click was heard, and he swore he saw the beast smirk before it bit down on his other foot as another wave of agonizing pain swept through his body. He couldn't help but yell out in pain, "It's only a dream! It's only a dream! It's only a dream! It's only a dream! It's only a dream!" He heard a deep, animalistic laugh before a voice he heard many times before said, "Not this time, Commander. VVVVV." Three people stood inside the mirror dimension as Mikhail took his revenge on his former commander. Flanked on either side of Tao stood Ezekiel and Mordo. Mordo grimaced as he asked, "Is this considered cannibalism?" Ezekiel shook his head and said, "No, he is clearly not eating the man," as Mikhail spit out the man's right hand after he bit it off. They watched in silence for a few more moments as Mikhail systematically ripped the man apart while he was still alive. Mordo spoke again as he said, "While I can understand the man's need for vengeance, I don't think you should have helped him with it in the way that you did." Tao nodded in agreement as she said, "If I was truly informed of what was going on, I would have never allowed you to help. While I am not against Mikhail seeking to punish the man or even killing him, your actions took this too far. Even though he was going to die, you still somehow broke his mind. In my defense, I didn't think that was going to happen. I just wanted to help out a little, as I didn't want the man to have an easy death. But honestly, it's a little terrifying to think I could do that by accident. I don't really plan to inform the others of your actions, mostly because Steve is the only one who would really look down on what you did here. But this isn't the first time you have shown this type of out-of-character behavior. We'll need to have a long talk once those young girls are rescued from the Widow program and try to figure out why this is happening." Tao crossed her arms over her chest and stared down at Ezekiel, who stood on her left side. "Yes, Master." Mordo's lips twitched up the tiniest bit in a smile before his face went back to his normal stoic look. Tao was still turned to Ezekiel as she said, "Don't worry, Master Mordo. We'll also be having a conversation about your actions during the last few days, later this week. Also, I believe it's your turn to help with cleaning duty around the temple this coming week." "I was on cleaning duty last." Tao glanced over her shoulder as she said, "For the next month." Whatever Mordo wanted to say, he stopped himself and replied, "Yes, Master." 00070. A conversation with concerned parents. To say Melina was disappointed would be an understatement. The fact that Alexei was imprisoned here and hadn't escaped yet was the main reason for her disappointment. While it was one of the most remote and secure prisons in the world, the security, or what passed for it, was a joke. The only thing that made this place hard to break out of was the location. It had only been a few days since she was visited by that man. She frowned as she walked down the hallway towards Alexei's cell. She should have actually listened to what the man had to say. She should have used her training and collected as much info as possible. Instead, she was unnerved by the man and his ability to read her so easily. She shook her head as she stopped in front of Alexei's cell and looked inside. He was seated on his bed as he looked at a picture. For a moment, she just watched him before she stepped inside as she asked, "What are you looking at so intently?" Alexei's head snapped up to look at her. The hard edges of his face softened slightly as he recognized Melina. He held up the photo in his hands. It showed him and Melina with two young girls in front of them. Melina sat down next to him as she asked, "He visited you as well?" "Duh." She studied his face for a few minutes before she asked, "What did he say?" Alexei glanced at the woman next to him for a moment before he turned his attention back to the photo. He looked at it for a few moments and then said, "A job and a chance to see the little ones again. He offered the same thing to me. If I accepted, I was to meet him in the Red Room in a few days." Alexei nodded his head as he said, "He told me I had till tomorrow, and he would come back for my decision." Melina glanced at Alexei, then the photo in his hands as she asked, "Have you made up your mind?" Alexei chuckled as he asked, "Have you?" They lapsed into a comfortable silence for almost an hour. The only thing that happened was Melina leaning over and Alexei wrapping an arm around her shoulder. Melina's voice broke the quiet atmosphere as she asked, if a voice laced with trepidation, "Do you think it's really possible that we could be together with the girls again?" Alexei tightened his grip reassuringly on her shoulder as he said, "Let's wait here for him to come back and then ask him. If we don't like his answers, we don't have to join him." Melina glanced up at Alexei as she asked, "What about the girls? We will take them with us." Melina frowned slightly as she said, "He's powerful. I don't think we can if he says no." Alexei shook his head as he said, "It'll be fine. He said he was like me. He has a hero complex. If he really does, he will let us have our girls." After a while, Melina laid her head back down on his chest as she said, "I'll trust your judgment then." Melina and Alexei stayed up for the whole day and most of the night talking with each other and catching up. It had been a few years since they had last seen each other, but it almost felt like they never separated. It was the afternoon when a portal appeared in the hallway outside of Alexei's cell, and out of it stepped Ezekiel followed by Tao. Alexei was seated on his bed near one edge reading a book. Melina was laying across the bed and had her head resting on Alexei's lap as she was also reading a book. Ezekiel stepped in front of the doorway and smiled when he saw them both as he said, "It's good to see you both again. I hope you had enough time to think about my offer." Melina sat up and placed her book down next to the one Alexei had just stopped reading. They both gave Ezekiel a cautious look before Melina asked, "What happens if we don't want to work for you and just want our girls?" Ezekiel paused for a few moments to think. He never really planned for them to turn him down. He did know it could happen, but he never really thought they would. He chuckled to himself before he said, "I guess I'll give you some money, so you can start a decent life somewhere." Now Alexei and Melina paused as they looked at each other, sharing a private conversation with just a glance. Melina looked back at Ezekiel as she asked, "Why would you help us if we aren't going to help you?" Ezekiel smirked as he said, "It's what heroes do." Tao smacked the back of Ezekiel's head before she stepped beside him and said, "The main reason is because we don't need you. The influx of girls will be a slight hassle to deal with at first, but we are more than capable of handling it." Tao slapped Ezekiel on the chest as she said, "He was the reason we even came with a recruitment pitch. He thinks highly of both of you and recommended that you would both be perfect to join our team." "Who exactly are either of you?" Alexei nodded his head after Melina spoke and added, "What country do you work for?" Ezekiel glanced at Tao as he said, "I am Ezekiel, and this is the current Sorcerer Supreme of the Earth Realm, Tao." Tao isn't her actual name, though. I just call her that because calling her the Ancient One like everyone else takes too long. As Tao glared slightly at Ezekiel, he leaned over a little, putting a hand next to his mouth and acted like he was telling a secret. But he actually raised his voice slightly as he said, "She may not look it, but she has protected the Earth from magical threats for over 800 years. She really puts the Ancient in the Ancient One." Ezekiel winked as he finished talking. Melina glanced over at Alexei for a moment before she looked at Tao and asked, "He's not being serious. That has to be a really lame joke, right?" Tao stopped glaring at Ezekiel as she said, "While my companion tends to joke around a little too much, he is currently speaking the truth." Ezekiel raised one of his eyebrows as he said, "There is literally someone who flies around in a red and purple jumpsuit, wearing a cape while acting like a Saturday morning cartoon villain, and you are going to ask if I am being serious?" Ezekiel shook his head before he said, "Whatever. It doesn't matter." Ezekiel turned slightly to look at Alexei as he said, "As for your question, we work for the betterment of the whole world, not just a single country." Alexei frowned as he asked, "So you work for S.H.I.E.L.D.?" Ezekiel laughed as he said, "No, we work for ourselves. Technically, the world doesn't even know we exist." Alexei glanced at Melina for another moment before Melina said, "You are being very talkative for someone from a hidden organization. What if we don't agree to join you? Aren't you afraid we could leak information about you?" Ezekiel shook his head as he said, "No, we have a few ways to remove that information from your mind." Both Melina and Alexei shared a concerned glance and tensed up slightly as they looked back at Ezekiel. Ezekiel raised his hands slightly as he said, "Look, it's only a worst-case scenario. Plus, you would keep your memories. They would just be altered." Ezekiel gestured at Tao as he said, "This conversation would change to something completely different, and me and Tao would look like new people. I know that doesn't sound reassuring, but we need to keep our secrets." Melina placed her hand on Alexei's, which made the man glance back at her for a few moments before he nodded his head. Melina then looked back up at Ezekiel as she asked, "What do we get if we join you? You said we would be reunited with our daughters, but you never said anything else. That's because you didn't want to have a normal conversation with me the first time." Melina crossed her arms over her chest as she said, "I was on edge because you just showed up at my house randomly and could somehow read my hidden hopes I had buried in the back of my mind." Ezekiel gave her a deadpan look before he said, "Anyone with half a brain could piece together your hidden desire if they read your psych profile and found that photo album you didn't exactly hide away." I never took the time to think about it like that. That was a stupid mistake on my part." Ezekiel nodded his head before he pointed back at Tao as he said, "Yes, yes it was. It also helped that we looked into the future and were shown that in more than half of them, you both worked with us. Natasha joins us about 90% of the time, and Yelena joins us about 60% of the time." Alexei's eyes narrowed slightly as he said, "You told us we could take our daughters if we refused to work with you." Ezekiel shook his head as he said, "You asked what would happen if you didn't work with us and just wanted your girls. My exact answer was, I guess I'll give you some money, so you can start a decent life somewhere." Ezekiel watched them for a moment, and as soon as Melina and Alexei tensed themselves to possibly attack them, Ezekiel said, "The main reason I never said the girls were going with you is because that is not my choice to make. Natasha and Yelena need to make the choice to join you or join us." Melina was still tense as she said, "They are just kids. They shouldn't be allowed to make that kind of decision." Ezekiel gave a hollow laugh as he said, "You know damn well that any girl who has been in the Red Room for more than a year is not really a kid anymore. The fact that they just passed their trust test just hammers that home." Melina looked down in shame as Ezekiel shook his head and said, "All of those girls are going to need a lot of work and therapy to become somewhat normal, Natasha and Yelena included. I plan to help them with that, but it would be easier if I had both of your help." Ezekiel, along with Tao, watched quietly as Alexei reached over and clasped hands with Melina as they shared a private conversation for a few minutes. Once done, Alexei looked back at Ezekiel as he said, "We will join you, but we want to be able to spend a lot of time with Natasha and Yelena." "Deal."